Under the weight of kindness. The train's whistle cut through the December air like a blade, its echo bouncing off the frozen fields that stretched endlessly around Camp McCoy. Sergeant Hiroshi Tanaka pressed his face against the cold window of the cattle car, watching smoke rise from distant farmhouses scattered across the Wisconsin landscape. The other prisoners huddled together in the corner, their tropical uniforms pathetic against the Midwestern winter that had arrived early and merciless. When the doors finally groaned open, the shock of bitter air hit them like a physical blow. Tanaka stepped down onto the wooden platform, his breath forming small clouds as he surveyed the camp that would be their home. Wooden barracks stretched in neat rows, surrounded by wire fences that cut geometric lines across what had once been pasture. Guard towers rose like skeletal fingers against the grey sky, and somewhere in the distance he could hear the low rumble of trucks carrying supplies. "Form up in lines of 5, the guard shouted in English, his words sharp but not cruel. Tanaka translated quietly for the others, noting how the young American soldiers' hands shook slightly in the cold. The guard couldn't be more than 20, with pale skin already reddening from the wind. Private Yamamoto, who had appointed himself the keeper of proper thinking among the prisoners, whispered urgently in Japanese as they shuffled forward. "Remember who we are. Remember what they've done to our people. Do not let their tricks weaken your spirit." Tanaka nodded, but said nothing. He was more concerned with the youngest prisoner, barely 19, who swayed on his feet from hunger and exhaustion. They had been fed only rice and thin broth for weeks during transport, and the boy's tropical uniform hung loose on his diminishing frame. The camp's commanding officer, Colonel Morrison, stood waiting in the administrative building, a practical man in his 50s who ran the facility according to Geneva Convention standards, while privately wondering how to manage men whose language he couldn't speak and whose customs he didn't understand. His chief concern was maintaining order until the war ended and these soldiers could be shipped home to whatever remained of their country. "Welcome to Camp McCoy," Morrison said through an interpreter, a Japanese-American sergeant whose presence made several prisoners stiffen with discomfort. "You will be treated according to international law, follow the rules, work when assigned, and will get along fine." As they were led to their barracks, Tanaka caught his first glimpse of the mess hall through an open door. The smell that emerged made him stop walking entirely. It was rich, complex, the aroma of grilled meat and fresh bread, so different from the thin gruel they had survived on that it seemed impossible. Other prisoners bumped into him as they tried to understand what they were smelling. Corporal Danny Mitchell, the guard assigned to their section, watched from nearby with growing discomfort. He had volunteered for this duty after his brother died in the Pacific, expecting to feel satisfaction at seeing the enemy caged. Instead, these men just looked tired and thin and cold. When he saw the youngest prisoner stumble, he caught himself stepping forward before remembering his orders to maintain distance. The barracks were warm, heated by coal stoves that radiated blessed warmth through the long wooden building. Each prisoner was assigned a cot with 2 wool blankets and a pillow, luxuries none of them had experienced in months. Tanaka ran his fingers over the rough wool, noting its thickness, its weight. Back home, his parents were probably sleeping under thin cotton quilts, if they were sleeping at all. "This is wrong," Yamamoto muttered, settling onto his cot with obvious reluctance. "They want to make us soft, grateful. It's a strategy to break our will." But when darkness fell and the coal stoves continued to pour out heat, when the blankets proved thick enough to actually provide warmth, Tanaka found himself grateful despite his better judgment. The boy in the next cot had stopped shivering for the first time in weeks. That had to matter more than ideology. The first shock came at evening meal on their second day. The mess hall doors swung open to reveal tables laden with thick hamburger patties, fried potatoes, and bottles of cola that caught the fluorescent light like amber jewels. The smell of grilled meat and fresh bread filled the air, so rich after months of deprivation that several prisoners stopped walking entirely. The cook, a round-faced corporal from Iowa, ladled generous portions without making eye contact, his movements efficient but not unkind. When Tanaka reached the front of the line, the young man paused, seemed about to speak, then simply nodded and filled his plate to overflowing. The hamburgers were unlike anything they had eaten at home, but the meat was real, the bread soft, the potatoes crispy with salt that made their mouths water. The bottles of Coca-Cola were ice-cold, the liquid sweet and sharp, with bubbles that stung their throats in the most wonderful way. Several men wept silently as they ate, overwhelmed by flavors they hadn't experienced in years, and shame they couldn't name. How could food this abundant, this rich, be routine for their captors when their own families were rationing rice? If stories like this make you question what you'd do in someone else's boots, tell us in the comments how you imagine you'd react in this camp, and stay with us for the next chapters. The routine at Camp McCoy developed quickly, as military routines always did. Wake at 6 to the sound of a bell, roll call in the yard regardless of weather, breakfast in the mess hall, work assignments, lunch, more work, dinner, and lights out at 10. The prisoners were assigned to help maintain the camp's infrastructure, clearing snow from paths, repairing roofs damaged by winter storms, and tending the heating systems that kept everyone alive through the brutal Wisconsin cold. Tanaka found himself assigned to the kitchen detail, peeling potatoes and washing dishes alongside American soldiers who gradually stopped seeing him as an abstraction from propaganda posters and began to recognize individual habits. He worked methodically, the way his father had taught him, and noticed that the kitchen staff appreciated efficiency over conversation. The abundance continued to shock him daily. Each morning brought fresh bread, real eggs, bacon that sizzled in great pans. The coffee was strong and hot, nothing like the thin substitute they had drunk in the army. When he mentioned this to Dr. Sarah Bennett, the camp's medical officer who was treating several prisoners for vitamin deficiency, she seemed surprised. "What did you eat before?" she asked in careful, slow English during his medical examination. She was a gentle woman in her 40s who had volunteered for this assignment because she believed in treating all patients with equal care, regardless of the uniform they had worn. "Rice," Tanaka replied, searching for the English words. "Little rice. Water with vegetables sometimes." Dr. Bennett made notes in her file, her expression troubled. She had requested additional nutrition for prisoners, showing signs of malnutrition, and was surprised when the care packages included what seemed like luxury items: chocolate powder, canned peaches, white sugar. Corporal Mitchell had begun bringing small gifts during his rounds: extra cigarettes, a magazine with pictures of American landscapes, a photograph of his hometown's main street in Minnesota that somehow reminded Tanaka of a village he had known as a child. They talked in broken English about farming, about the difference between Japanese and American winters, about books they had read. "My brother," Mitchell said one evening, showing Tanaka a small photograph of a young man in Navy uniform. "He died at Guadalcanal." Tanaka studied the picture, seeing his own younger brother's face in the American sailor's smile. "My brother also," he said quietly. "Philippines." They sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of shared loss settling between them like fresh snow. But Private Yamamoto grew more agitated as the days passed. He watched the other prisoners learning English words, accepting second helpings of food, even laughing at something one of the guards had said. During the evening hours in the barracks, he delivered quiet speeches about honor and duty, reminding them that their emperor still fought, their families still suffered. "Look at yourselves," he said one night, his voice low but intense. "Growing fat on enemy food while our people starve, learning their language while our cities burn. Have you forgotten the Bushido Code? Have you forgotten who you are?" Tanaka lay on his cot, staring at the ceiling. The latest letter from his sister had arrived that afternoon, 3 months old and carefully censored. She wrote that their parents had been relocated to his uncle's farm in the mountains, that food was scarce and winter fuel scarcer. Meanwhile, he had eaten hamburger and fried potatoes for lunch, had drunk cold Coca-Cola with dinner. The contrast created a dissonance he struggled to process. How could he reconcile the care he received here with the propaganda they had been taught? Americans were supposed to be brutal, wasteful, lacking in honor. But Colonel Morrison ran the camp with quiet efficiency, ensuring the heating systems worked and the food was adequate. Dr. Bennett treated their illnesses with the same attention she gave American patients. The moral complexity deepened when news from home began arriving through Red Cross channels. The massive bombing campaigns, the evacuation of cities, the increasing desperation of the homeland situation. Each letter brought fresh guilt. His cousin in Tokyo wrote that entire neighborhoods had been reduced to ash, that survivors were living in subway tunnels and eating grass soup. Yet here he was, warm and fed, learning to enjoy the taste of American coffee. One morning, while working in the kitchen, Tanaka overheard the cook talking to another soldier about his own rationing back home. Even in America, sugar and meat were carefully distributed, families given ration books and asked to sacrifice for the war effort. The abundance he witnessed at Camp McCoy wasn't representative of American civilian life. It was military necessity, designed to keep prisoners healthy and productive. This revelation somehow made the kindness worse. These men were sharing their military rations with enemy prisoners, while their own families did without. It's psychological warfare, Yamamoto insisted when Tanaka shared this observation. They want us to feel indebted, grateful. When we return home, we'll speak of their mercy and weaken our people's resolve. But Tanaka had begun to wonder if Yamamoto's certainty was its own kind of blindness. The freckled kitchen corporal who always gave him extra bread didn't seem capable of psychological manipulation. He was just a farm boy from Iowa who had been taught that prisoners deserved adequate food. That night, lying under his warm wool blanket, Tanaka thought about a conversation he'd had with Dr. Bennett about medical ethics. She had explained that doctors took an oath to do no harm, to treat all patients equally regardless of their nationality or the uniform they wore. Even enemies, he had asked. Especially enemies, she had replied. That's what separates civilization from barbarism. The words stayed with him as winter deepened around Camp McCoy, as the routines continued and the war news grew more dire for Japan. He was beginning to understand that the kindness he received here might not be strategy or manipulation. It might simply reflect the particular values of these particular people. March brought the first hints of spring to Wisconsin, but also the most devastating news from the Pacific Theater. The massive bombing campaigns had intensified, and letters from home, when they arrived at all, painted a picture of a homeland being systematically destroyed. Tanaka sat on his bunk holding a letter from his sister that had taken 4 months to reach him, the paper thin and precious in his hands. His cousin's neighborhood in Tokyo had been reduced to ash in a single night. No one knew how many had survived. The city where he had gone to teachers' college no longer existed, except as a blackened scar on the earth. His sister wrote that people were eating bark soup and living in caves, that children cried from hunger while their fathers fought hopeless battles on distant islands. That night, he couldn't sleep. Every bite of the evening's hamburger felt like a betrayal of everyone he had left behind. The bottle of Coca-Cola he had enjoyed with dinner seemed to mock the suffering of his family. How could he accept comfort from the people who were burning his homeland? How could he feel grateful to his captors while his people suffered? Private Yamamoto had grown more fervent in his evening speeches, feeding on the despair that came with each delivery of mail. He spoke of duty, of honor, of the shame that would follow them home if they allowed enemy kindness to corrupt their spirits. "They bomb our cities by night and feed us meat by day," he said, his voice carrying through the barracks. "They want us to forget that we are warriors, that we swore to die before accepting capture. Look at us now, grateful for scraps from our conqueror's table. Several prisoners nodded agreement, their guilt and confusion finding voice in Yamamoto's certainty, but others turned away, unwilling to reject the first kindness they had known in years, even if it came from enemy hands. The crisis deepened when a new transport arrived from the Pacific, bringing fresh prisoners with stories of the homeland's desperation. They spoke of cities burned to nothing, of families separated and starving, of a war that everyone knew was lost, but that honor demanded they continue fighting. The contrast with their situation at Camp McCoy became impossible to ignore. Corporal Mitchell noticed the change in the prisoners' mood. The way conversations stopped when American soldiers approached. The way men who had been learning English phrases suddenly refused to speak anything but Japanese. He mentioned his concerns to Dr. Bennett during one of their regular consultations about prisoner welfare. "They're getting news from home," she observed. "Bad news, from the look of them. Guilt is harder on the body than most people realize." She had been treating an increasing number of prisoners for what she recognized as symptoms of psychological distress. Insomnia, loss of appetite, the kind of inattention that manifested as physical ailments. Tanaka had come to the infirmary that morning, not sick, but seeking somewhere quiet to think. "It's hard to carry gratitude and grief at the same time," she told him after listening to his careful explanation of his inner turmoil. "But maybe that's what makes us human, holding contradictory feelings without letting them destroy us." Her words offered little comfort. The contradiction felt like it was tearing him apart. When he worked in the kitchen, peeling potatoes and washing dishes, he felt peaceful, useful, almost normal. But when he returned to the barracks and saw Yamamoto's accusing stare, when he read letters describing his family's suffering, the guilt became overwhelming. The breaking point came during a Red Cross inspection in late March. The inspector, a stern Swiss man who took his neutrality seriously, interviewed prisoners about their treatment, their living conditions, their access to mail and medical care. Most answered carefully, aware that Yamamoto was listening, that anything they said might be interpreted as collaboration. But when the inspector asked about food, about whether they received adequate nutrition, several prisoners couldn't hide their confusion. Adequate? They were eating better than they had in years, better than their families at home were eating, better than seemed possible in the middle of a war. "Is there anything you need?" the inspector asked. "Any complaints about your treatment?" Tanaka found himself thinking about the chocolate powder Dr. Bennett had served them the week before, rich and sweet and warm, the kind of luxury that belonged to peacetime. He thought about Mitchell's small gifts, about the kitchen staff's casual generosity, about Colonel Morrison's quiet efficiency in ensuring their basic needs were met. "No complaints," he said finally, the words feeling like stones in his throat. After the inspection, Yamamoto confronted him directly for the first time. "You're becoming their pet," he said, his voice low and dangerous, "learning their language, praising their food, accepting their gifts. When we return home, what will you tell the families of the men who died fighting these same Americans? That they treated you well, that they were kind." The question haunted Tanaka through the long spring nights. What would he tell his parents about his time in captivity? What would he say to the widow of his best friend, who had died charging an American machine gun position? How could he explain that the enemy had been more generous to him than his own officers had ever been? The moral weight of these questions grew heavier as spring progressed and news from the Pacific Front became more desperate. Japan was clearly losing the war, and everyone in Camp McCoy, prisoners and guards alike, knew it was only a matter of time before surrender came. But that knowledge made the contradictions worse, not better. If Japan surrendered, what would become of the prisoners? Would they be sent home to face the shame of survival, of having accepted enemy kindness? Would they be able to rebuild lives in a country that might blame them for losing face, for allowing themselves to be captured? Tanaka watched the spring snow melt around Camp McCoy, revealing the rich Wisconsin soil beneath, and wondered if he would ever be able to reconcile the man he had been with the man this place was making him become. Do you think you cling to what you were taught back home, or to what your own eyes see in a place like this? Comment which side you'd lean toward, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. The spring thaw brought new work details and an unexpected softening in the daily routines at Camp McCoy. Prisoners were assigned to help with maintenance projects that required them to work alongside American soldiers, and the language barriers began to break down through the necessity of communication. Tanaka found himself learning more English words each day, not from formal lessons, but from the practical vocabulary of shared labor. "Hand me that wrench," Mitchell would say, and Tanaka would understand from context, from gesture, from the growing familiarity between them. "Wrench," Tanaka would repeat, testing the word, and Mitchell would nod approval. These small exchanges felt natural, almost inevitable, but Tanaka was always aware of Yamamoto watching from across the work detail, noting every word of English, every moment of cooperation. The ideological pressure in the barracks had become nearly unbearable, with Yamamoto's faction growing more rigid as news from home grew worse. Doctor Bennett had begun serving hot chocolate on particularly cold mornings, preparing cup after cup of the sweet drink that filled the infirmary with steam and the aroma of vanilla and sugar. She had noticed that several prisoners were showing signs of vitamin deficiency and hoped the additional nutrition would help, but the psychological effect was even more profound than the physical benefits. When Tanaka first tasted the liquid chocolate, something inside him broke open. The sweetness was overwhelming, but it was more than that. It was comfort, indulgence, the kind of small pleasure that belonged to peacetime, to safety, to being cared for rather than merely kept alive. Around him, other men made soft sounds of surprise and pleasure, and several wept openly. "This is humiliation," Yamamoto announced later, having refused to drink his portion. "They mock us with their abundance while our families starve. They offer us luxuries to make us forget our duty." But Tanaka couldn't stop thinking about the taste, about the warmth spreading through his chest, about the gentle way Dr. Bennett had handed him the cup. He had begun to understand that her kindness wasn't calculated or strategic. It was simply who she was, the way she treated all patients regardless of their nationality. The revelation deepened during a conversation about medical ethics that took place during one of his regular checkups. Dr. Bennett explained her philosophy of care, her belief that healing required treating the whole person, not just their physical symptoms. "In my training, we learned about something called the Hippocratic Oath," she said in her careful, slow English. "First, do no harm. It means I treat everyone the same way, whether they're American soldiers or enemy prisoners." "Even if we are enemies?" Tanaka asked. "Especially then," she replied. "That's what separates medicine from warfare. My job is to heal, not to judge." Her words stayed with him as the work details continued through April. He was assigned to help repair the camp's heating system, working in the basement of the administrative building where he overheard conversations between American officers about prisoner welfare. They discussed nutrition requirements, medical needs, recreation opportunities, treating the prisoners' well-being as a serious responsibility, not a political weapon. Colonel Morrison, he learned, had requested additional supplies specifically for the prisoners' comfort: more blankets, better medical equipment, recreational materials. The camp commander seemed genuinely concerned about maintaining humane conditions, even as reports from the Pacific Front suggested that American prisoners weren't receiving similar treatment. This knowledge created another layer of moral complexity. How could he reconcile the care he received with the stories of brutality coming from Japanese prison camps? Were these Americans unusually principled, or had he been taught lies about their nature? The question became more urgent when a local church group visited Camp McCoy in early May, bringing gifts for the prisoners. The children pressed candy bars through the fence, shy offerings from small hands to men they had been told were once enemies, but who now just looked like anyone's older brothers or fathers. Tanaka accepted a chocolate bar from a freckled girl who reminded him of his niece, the child's eyes wide with curiosity rather than fear. As the sweet candy melted in his mouth, he finally understood that kindness could exist without ulterior motive, that enemies could be human without becoming friends. The visit had an unexpected effect on the prisoners. Several men began crying as they accepted gifts from children, overwhelmed by the simple generosity of the gesture. Even some of Yamamoto's supporters seemed shaken by the encounter, unable to reconcile their hatred with the innocent faces at the fence. But Yamamoto himself grew more desperate in response, sensing that his ideological control was slipping. That evening, he delivered his most impassioned speech yet, reminding the prisoners of their duty to the emperor, their obligation to maintain honor even in captivity. "They use children now," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. "They parade their innocence before us to weaken our resolve. But remember, these same children will grow up to be soldiers who will fight our sons, our brothers. This kindness is poison, meant to corrupt our spirits." Tanaka lay awake that night, torn between Yamamoto's logic and his own experience. He thought about the chocolate bar, about the girl's shy smile, about Dr. Bennett's patient care. He thought about Mitchell's stories of home, about the kitchen staff's casual generosity, about Colonel Morrison's quiet competence. Were these people his enemies? They had been certainly when he wore a uniform and carried a rifle. But here, in this strange, suspended reality of camp life, they seemed more like fellow human beings, caught in the same impossible situation, trying to maintain dignity and decency while the world burned around them. The contradiction was becoming unbearable. Something would have to give, and soon. The revelation came in the form of a diary that Tanaka discovered while cleaning Colonel Morrison's office during a work detail. The leather-bound book had fallen behind a filing cabinet, and when he picked it up, it fell open to an entry dated 3 weeks earlier. His English was now good enough to understand most of what he read, and what he found there changed everything. Morrison had written about the difficulty of maintaining Geneva Convention standards while knowing that American prisoners in Japanese camps were receiving no such consideration. Intelligence reports described horrific conditions, deliberate starvation, systematic brutality. Yet Morrison struggled with the moral question: should he reduce care for Japanese prisoners in response, or maintain the standards he believed were right, regardless of reciprocity? "If we become like our enemies," Morrison had written, "we lose something essential about who we are. These men are prisoners, not monsters. They deserve basic human dignity, even if our boys aren't receiving the same treatment." The diary entry continued with Morrison's private observations about individual prisoners, including Tanaka himself. The colonel had noticed his work ethic, his care for the younger prisoners, his growing proficiency in English. Morrison wrote that he saw potential for Tanaka to serve as a bridge between cultures after the war, someone who could help both sides understand that their enemies were human beings. Tanaka carefully returned the diary to its place, but the words burned in his memory. Morrison's kindness wasn't naive or strategic. It was a deliberate choice to maintain his own moral standards regardless of what others did. The abundant food, the medical care, the respect for prisoner welfare, all of it represented a conscious decision to remain civilized even in an uncivilized time. That afternoon, Dr. Bennett prepared another round of hot chocolate for the prisoners being treated for respiratory infections that had spread through the barracks. As she handed Tanaka his cup, she noticed his troubled expression. "Something wrong?" she asked gently. "Doctor," Tanaka said carefully, testing his English, Why you help us? Japanese prisoners, maybe Americans in Japan not helped same way. Dr. Bennett considered the question seriously, stirring her own cup of chocolate as she thought. "I can't control what happens in other places," she said finally. "I can only control what I do here in this moment with these patients. If I compromise my principles because of what others do, then I become something I don't want to be." Her words echoed Morrison's diary entry, and Tanaka began to understand something profound about the people who had become his captors. Their kindness wasn't weakness or calculation, it was strength, the strength to remain true to their values, even when those values weren't reciprocated. The understanding came with a price. If these Americans were genuinely decent people acting from principle, what did that say about everything he had been taught? If they could maintain their humanity while fighting a war, what about the stories of Japanese soldiers committing atrocities in occupied territories? Had he been fighting for a cause that abandoned the very honor it claimed to represent? The crisis deepened when news arrived of Germany's surrender. The war in Europe was over, which meant all Allied resources would now focus on the Pacific theater. Japan's situation was hopeless, and everyone knew it. Surrender was inevitable, but what would that mean for the prisoners at Camp McCoy? That evening, Yamamoto gathered his supporters for what felt like a final stand against what he saw as the corruption of their spirits. "They have filled your bellies and clouded your minds," he said, his voice breaking with desperation. "When we return home, if we return home, what will you tell your families? That the enemy was kind to you while your brothers died fighting them? That you learned to love your captors?" For the first time, Tanaka spoke back. What if they were never really our enemies? What if they were just men like us, caught in a war none of us started? The question hung in the air like smoke. Several prisoners shifted uncomfortably, unwilling to confront its implications. Yamamoto stared at Tanaka with something approaching hatred. "You have become a traitor," he said quietly, "not to your country, but to your own soul." The words cut deep because Tanaka feared they might be true. Had his gratitude corrupted him? Had he betrayed some essential part of himself by accepting American kindness? Or had he simply learned something about human nature that was too complicated for simple categories of friend and enemy? That night, unable to sleep, he walked to the infirmary where Dr. Bennett was working late, treating a prisoner who had developed pneumonia. She looked up from her patient and nodded for him to sit in a nearby chair. "Can't sleep?" she asked. "Too much thinking," he replied, then struggled to find the English words for what he needed to express. "Doctor, when war is finished, how I tell family about here? About kindness from enemy?" Dr. Bennett finished checking her patient's temperature before responding. "Maybe the hardest part of surviving a war isn't the fighting," she said slowly. "Maybe it's learning to live with all the contradictory truths you discover. People aren't all good or all bad. Enemies can be decent. Allies can be cruel. Your job isn't to resolve the contradictions, it's to carry them honestly." The chocolate she offered him that night tasted different than before. Still sweet, still comforting, but now carrying the weight of everything he had learned. As the liquid warmed his throat, Tanaka realized that he would never again be the simple man who had stepped off the train at Camp McCoy. The person he was becoming would have to find a way to live with gratitude and guilt, understanding and confusion, love and loss, all mixed together. The war was ending, but his real struggle was just beginning. August brought news that changed everything. Atomic bombs had been dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and Emperor Hirohito had announced Japan's surrender. The war was over, and the prisoners at Camp McCoy would be going home, or at least to whatever remained of home. Tanaka sat in the mess hall, staring at a final hamburger and bottle of Coca-Cola, no longer tasting the food that had once seemed impossibly abundant. The other prisoners ate in silence, each man wrestling with his own version of the same question. How do you return to a country that might see your survival as shame, carrying memories of enemy kindness that feel like betrayal? The repatriation process would take months. Ships had to be arranged, documents prepared, medical clearances obtained. During that time, the prisoners remained at Camp McCoy, living in a strange limbo between war and peace, between captivity and freedom. Private Yamamoto had grown increasingly isolated as surrender became inevitable. The ideological certainties that had sustained him throughout captivity crumbled in the face of total defeat. Japan hadn't just lost the war. It had been devastated so completely that survival, not honor, was now the only priority. His evening speeches stopped, replaced by long periods of silent brooding. Colonel Morrison called a general assembly to explain the repatriation process and to address what he knew must be the prisoners' primary concern, what they would tell their families and government about their treatment at Camp McCoy. "You will not be required to make any statements about your experiences here," Morrison said through the interpreter. "What you choose to share is entirely up to you. Some things are easier to forget than to explain." The colonel's words carried a subtle understanding of the prisoner's dilemma, and Tanaka appreciated the gesture even as he knew forgetting would be impossible. Dr. Bennett began conducting final medical examinations, documenting each prisoner's physical condition for the long journey home. When she examined Tanaka, she noted how much healthier he looked than when he had arrived. Proper nutrition and medical care had restored much of his strength. "You'll do fine back home," she said, completing her notes. "You're a survivor." "Doctor," Tanaka said carefully, I want thank you for chocolate, for care, for showing enemy can be human." Dr. Bennett smiled sadly. "Take care of yourself, Hiroshi. Help your country heal." Corporal Mitchell offered his own farewell gifts. Photographs of Wisconsin landscapes, a small English dictionary, and a letter from his family thanking Tanaka for the friendship that had helped Mitchell process his own grief about his brother's death. "Maybe someday," Mitchell said, "when things are normal again, you can visit, see what peacetime America looks like." The idea seemed impossible, but Tanaka accepted the invitation graciously, understanding that it represented something larger than tourism, a hope that former enemies could become something other than enemies. As the departure date approached, Tanaka made a decision that would haunt him for years. He began keeping a private record of his experiences at Camp McCoy, writing in Japanese on scraps of paper that he hid in his belongings. Not a diary exactly, but a testimony to the complexity of what he had experienced. He wrote about the hamburgers and Coca-Cola that had shocked him with their abundance, about Dr. Bennett's patient care and Morrison's principled leadership, about Mitchell's friendship and the children who had offered candy through the fence, about the impossible contradiction of being treated with dignity by people he had been taught to hate. But he also wrote about the guilt, the confusion, the way kindness could feel like a betrayal of everyone who hadn't survived to experience it. He wrote about Yamamoto's desperate attempts to maintain ideological purity, and about his own slow recognition that human nature was more complicated than any propaganda could capture. The final entry described his last conversation with Dr. Bennett, when she had spoken about carrying contradictory truths without letting them destroy you. He wrote that he was going home, carrying both gratitude and grief, understanding and confusion, and that somehow this mixture of feelings seemed more honest than the simple certainties he had once embraced. The transport ship left from San Francisco in November, 7 months after Japan's surrender. As Tanaka watched the American coast disappear behind them, he felt the weight of everything he would never be able to fully explain to anyone who hadn't lived through it. The journey home took 3 weeks, and during that time, the former prisoners began the difficult process of deciding what parts of their experience they would share. Some, like Yamamoto, chose total silence, refusing to speak about their captivity at all. Others created sanitized versions that emphasized hardship while omitting kindness. Tanaka chose a middle path. When he finally reached his family's farm in the mountains, when his parents wept with relief at his survival, when neighbors gathered to hear his stories, he spoke truthfully, but carefully. He described the cold Wisconsin winters, the work details, the basic adequacy of the food and shelter. He didn't mention the abundance that had shocked him, the friendships that had developed, the way enemy doctors had cared for him as tenderly as they cared for their own soldiers. But he kept his written testimony hidden in a wooden box that he buried beneath the cherry tree behind his family's house. Someday, he told himself, when enough time had passed, when the wounds of war had healed sufficiently, he might share the full truth about Camp McCoy, or perhaps his children, or his children's children, would find his words and understand something important about the complexity of human nature, about the possibility of kindness even in the darkest times. Years later, as an old man teaching school children about the war, Tanaka would sometimes taste something sweet, a piece of candy, a cup of hot tea, and remember the flavor of American chocolate melting on his tongue. The memory would bring both joy and sorrow, gratitude and guilt, all mixed together in a way that he had finally learned to accept. He never did visit Wisconsin, never saw Corporal Mitchell again, or learned what became of Dr. Bennett. But he carried their kindness with him like a secret treasure, proof that even enemies could surprise you with their humanity, and that sometimes the greatest victories came not from conquering opponents, but from allowing them to teach you something unexpected about the complicated nature of the human heart. The war had ended, but the lessons of Camp McCoy lasted a lifetime. If this story reminded you that even in the darkest times, small acts of humanity still matter, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.